Grade 10, Ahlan wa sahlan ya Hamir. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone is doing well during these strange times. And I hope to see you soon. I miss you guys so much. So today I want to continue on with the class. So we've basically finished up chapter 13 concerning the basics on the Middle Ages, and now I want to move on to chapter 14, which will talk about the formation of Western Europe during the time period 800 to 1500. But first, I want to thank everyone who's been logging into Google Classroom, completing the assignments, and basically participating. I really appreciate it, and I hope that as time goes on, I will be able to continue on this platform to give you lessons. So anyways, here's what we'll do. We will basically carry on here. So I will begin the lesson. So just to reiterate, we're going to begin today chapter 14, the formation of Western Europe, 800 to 1500. And we're going to cover section 1, which is going to talk about church reform and the Crusades. Okay, and here are the objectives, and here's what I'm going to talk about today. So theme 1 is going to cover changes in the church from between the period of 1000 to 1200 AD. As we'll see, the church was facing some issues and problems, and they made some changes. Theme 2, we're going to talk about the rise of the Crusades. Theme 3, we're going to talk about the fall of Crusades, essentially the failure of the Crusades. And theme 4, we're going to talk about what impacts the Crusades have on Europe. Okay, so that's how we're going to proceed for the lesson. So let's begin. Theme 1, changes in the church. Okay, so we can say probably around 900 AD, the church was facing several problems, both spiritually and organizationally. Okay, so this time period, let me back up a minute. The time period, 1000 to 1200, is important because this is considered the time when Europe comes out of the so-called Dark Ages, okay? And we'll see from, some of the things in the Dark Ages, this is what caused some of the problems in the church, and this is when they start to come out of these Dark Ages. So, one of the problems that was going on in the church at the time was that there was a high illiteracy rate among priests, and illiteracy means that these priests could not read or write. So if you are a priest standing in front of a congregation and you need to read a passage from the Bible, how are you going to do that? So that's a problem. People were starting to see through that. Another problem was that the morality of popes and bishops were becoming questionable. So popes were engaging in questionable behavior, like, womanizing maybe, things like this. Doing things that a pope or a priest or a bishop should not be doing. And also, there was the problem, and we kind of mentioned this before in the previous lessons, bishops and the clergy, if you remember that vocab word from before, the clergy was being more loyal to feudal lords rather than the church. So this was a problem for the church. Furthermore, the church was also facing corruption. Bishops were corrupt. So, for example, they would, charge money for, becoming a noble or a lord. So like, hey, you want my blessing? That's $10,000. So practices like this. And also village priests were married and having families. And this was becoming problematic because priests were not focused on their devotion to the religion. Rather, they're, as any other person would do, they're more focused on the family and things like this. And this fueled a movement of reform within the church, okay? And it's not like, the Reformation, as we'll see later, but it's actually kind of like, we'll see, a reform and a movement towards extremism, as in today's world, we would probably consider these people extremists. So, to continue with theme 1, changes in the church, because of the previously mentioned problems, what the church reformers believed was that the followers, whatever that be, the ordinary citizens, the bishops, the priests, the pope, they needed to return to the basic principles of the Christian religion. Like we're moving away from the basics here. We need to go back to how Christianity and Catholicism was practiced in the past. And because these people of the past were more spiritually woke than we are now, we need to get back to this. So you see during this time period a movement towards more extreme devotion and reverence within the church. Also, what happened during this time period, and to make this happen, you see the office of the papacy or the pope expand its power and authority, and that's supposed to say over kings and lords. So we remember these kings and lords are making bishops and priests be loyal to them. The church really expanded their power and authority to counter this, okay? And this period of time would become to be known as the Age of Faith. So the movement towards the reform back towards the most basic and traditional practices of Catholicism, or more generally at this time, the Christian religion. Because Catholicism was the dominant form of Christianity in Europe. Okay, so I hope that makes sense, and if not, we can discuss it later and move on. So this reform to continue, this movement back to a more, extreme form of Christianity, and to exert their power and authority over the nobles and lords, the church became more invasive in everyday life for not only the lords and nobles, but the ordinary people. For example, the church imposed and collected a religious tax from the ordinary people, and they expanded canon law to control more aspects of life. So not only through this canon law, they're starting to now control like property rights, marriage rights, things like this. They also at this time, and this practice still continues today in the Catholic Church, priests were outlawed from being married, and made sure more strictly that priests and bishops remain loyal to the church, not noble lords. The first point is what still is carried on today. Today in the Catholic Church, priests are not allowed to marry. It's forbidden. So as you can see, you're seeing an expansion of the church into people's everyday lives here. They're trying to control every aspect of life. And also, another way that they did this, but it was also an attempt to make people happy, so it looks like they're doing some good. But this is another way that they expanded into everyday life, is that the church became the provider of important social services. For example, most hospitals were owned and ran by the church. So, a hospital during the Middle Ages where disease and sickness was fatal, hospitals were very important. So these were ran and organized by the church. So they could say, hey, look, see, we're providing for you hospitals and, food banks and things like this. You're not so bad. So they had to do this to keep the people, happy. And also, just a little side note during this time, I think Catholicism during this time, you see different sects emerging during this time, such as the sects of Benedictine, Franciscan, and Dominican. And these different, I don't know what you want to call them, styles of Catholicism, just different types of strict devotions in the way they practice Catholicism. And they gained some followings and things like that. But it was all good for the church as a whole because they were, practicing, the basic, strict, devotional practices of Christianity. So the Pope didn't have too many problems with them. So that's kind of the background of what's going on in the church at this time, okay? So we see the rise of religious devotion and extreme forms of practice. But unfortunately, what this does, as it also gives way to extreme modes of thinking about the religion. And one way in which this was manifested was through war. Specifically, the Crusades. And I'm sure we've all heard of the Crusades. And they were a major failure for Europe. But this is an example of how, extremist thinking can lead to, people embarking on campaigns of war in the name of, bringing people under religious control. So what happened is that in 1095, Pope Urban II convinced a church council to launch the Crusades, or basically what the Crusades are, was a conquest to retake the Holy Land from the Muslims. If you remember the Seljuks, they were the ones who the Byzantines at the time and the Christians were going to fight, because they had, if you remember at this time, 1095, the Seljuks were in control of the Holy Land. So basically why Pope Urban II held this council is because that he received a letter from the Byzantine emperor at the time, who was being overrun by Muslim invaders. He couldn't control them anymore. They were knocking on the doorstep of Constantinople. They had taken Jerusalem. I need help. Okay? And remember, during this time, the church was expanding its power and authority and control over the people. So Pope Urban II saw this as an opportunity, and not just a religious opportunity to say, hey, look at us, we're great Christians, we're defending our Holy Land, blah, blah, blah. But this was also a political opportunity for the Pope. He saw it as a chance to reunite the Western and Eastern empires. Remember, Rome split. So Pope Urban II had this vision that, hey, we can, we'll team up with the Eastern Empire, we'll take back Jerusalem, and we can unite the empire once again. And he also saw it as an opportunity to unite warring lords and knights throughout Europe, obviously to gain more control over them, because, at this time they were having problems of loyalty of the bishops and priests to these lords and knights. So, hey, we can unite them, and, we can have more, it's easier to control a united faction, rather than division. So basically the launching of the Crusades was not only, something that was, strictly out of religion, but it was a very calculated political move by the church for control of Europe. It was almost like retaking the Holy Land was almost like secondary. It was just a name. Really, if you dig into it, it was really, like I said, a political calculation by the church to expand their control and authority over Europe. So what happened? Pope Urban II was able to rally the masses. So, and how did he do that? He did that with, assurances that if you gather and you embark on these crusades and you die, you will be a martyr and you automatically have a place in heaven. So through, edicts like this, Christian Europe was able to amass an army and take it to the outskirts of Constantinople and meet up with, the Byzantines. However, the motivation was there. Yes, if I die, I'll go to heaven. That's my Christian duty to, preserve the Holy Land, blah, 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 all this type of, rhetoric. The Crusaders were actually very ill-prepared for this military campaign. Remember, the people to go and fight were gathered by, they were parts of different rival warring lords and nobles, so, nobody could agree on leadership. There was no really organization of the army. They kind of just amassed around Constantinople, and about 12,000 of them marched on Jerusalem. However, by a stroke of luck, I would say, they were able to besiege and capture Jerusalem on July 15th, 1099. And I think the Seljuks were kind of they were also ill-prepared. I don't think they took the threat as serious as they should have. However, and that's the only time the Crusaders would ever taste success in terms of, their mission to retake the Holy Land. The victory was short-lived. Again, it was very disorganized. They had no idea how to, hold. First of all, they only gained a small portion of territory, what is now modern-day Palestine, and into Lebanon, I think. But eventually, if you remember Saladin, or Salah al-Adin, I think is how you say it, he was able to take back Jerusalem easily in 1187, and the European Christians, they attempted to, embark on a third crusade in 1192, but failed miserably, and Saladin was able to fight him off. So basically, the only time Europe, the Catholic Church, was successful was the First Crusade, and again, it was just, I think, a stroke of luck, and they managed to do it. But as they didn't hold it for long. It did not last for long. So that can take us to theme 3, the fall of the Crusades, because this is a period of time where there was great Christian spirit in Europe, a sense of honor, a sense of pride. We need to be defending the faith. It's the age of faith. We need to be defending it. So, however, the spirit of the Crusades dwindled, or became smaller, simply because they were unsuccessful. I mean, yeah, they were successful once, but then they just kept being defeated again and again by the Muslims, who had by this time retaken Jerusalem. And also, the Crusades became something that people used for personal gain rather than, a spiritual mission. So people that embarked on the Crusades, did it to make money, set up, stores and stuff for Crusaders going, to Jerusalem. And once, some Crusaders made it to Jerusalem, they saw what a thriving, trading area it was, and started to do business, things like this. So they're really, what are we doing? So the spirit, fell. At one point in time, people were excited about the Crusades. By 1200, they didn't care. There were some other very, very weak attempts at Crusades, but failed miserably. Most of the time, they didn't even make it to the Holy. They didn't even make it out of Europe. And there's something in your book. There's an example of something called the Children's Crusade, where some guy, to be honest, his name is slipping my mind, but he tried to amass an army of 20,000, basically 12-year-olds, and take them to the Holy Land. Most didn't even make it out of Europe because they died along the way because of wintertime. The ones that did make it onto the boats to go to the Holy Land were never heard from again. So it's attempts like that, and just complete failure and senseless. However, there was one more, I guess you could say, crusade, and that was that happened in Spain, in something called the Reconquista, where, if we remember talking about Muslim expansion, that the original Muslim expansion made it all the way into the Iberian Peninsula, what is now modern-day Spain, and they had controlled most of Spain for hundreds of years. I think maybe 700 or 800 years, or at this point, something like that. But through this spirit, motivated by the original crusading spirit, the small Christian kingdoms that remained in Spain were able to actually drive out the Muslims, and they reconquered Spain and retook Spain from the Muslims. And this also led to something called the Spanish Inquisition, You might have heard this term before. But once, the Spanish Christians and Queen Isabella had, reconquered all of Spain, they set out on a purge, I guess you could call it. So they attempted to identify heretics, people who weren't Christians, basically. You would be put on trial and then killed, generally, if you refused to convert. So you see a lot of people not only dying, for refusing to convert to Christianity, but you also see mass conversions of Christianity in Spain at this time. Muslims and Jewish people who still lived there, converted, or were killed. And that's the basics of the Spanish Inquisition. So this is like the end of the crusade period, as we should say. So that brings us to the final theme 4. What were the impacts of the Crusades? Like what happened because of that? Well, basically we can look back and say that the Crusades is a prime example of the power of the church during the Middle Ages. I mean, they were able to convince nobles and lords and ordinary people to travel to distant lands to fight for Christianity. They were able to control people very well, and this is the Crusades is a prime example of that. Also, the Crusades kind of, I don't know if this is the proper word to use, kind of maybe globalized the beginnings of a globalized Europe, because it exposed them to international trade, especially places in Southwest Asia. And this would become more of the lure rather than the religious duty. So before they really didn't know too much about the Holy Land, or like Persia, or having access to goods coming from India. The Crusades introduced Europeans to this. So this opened their eyes that, hey, there's a whole other world out there, basically. And also, what the Crusades did is that it lessened the power of the Pope. Its failure actually was seen as a sign of weakness in the papacy. And as we will see, this started to turn the table for the nobles and kings, because they were able to use the failure of the Crusades to convince people that the kings and nobles should have more authority and power in their territories in Europe, because the Pope and the Church was unable to prove themselves militarily, I should say. So that will be the end of the lesson today, and I hope that tomorrow I can provide you with another lesson. And stay tuned for an assignment. Please keep your eyes peeled to the Google Classroom, because I'll also post, maybe some readings that I come across, just, that you can read at your leisure, or if you're interested in the topic, further readings, things like this. But again, I want to thank everybody for participating and staying engaged, even though we cannot meet face to face. So thank you guys, and I'll see you soon.